My name is Drusilla Rivera. I am 29 years old. On a freezing November evening, sitting at a long mahogany dining table surrounded by 50 relatives, my father tapped his crystal wine glass and proudly announced that he had sold my home. I had just survived a brutal highway collision that left me in a medically induced coma for 4 weeks. While I was unconscious on a hospital ventilator, my parents used a forged document to liquidate my $280,000 Alexandria townhouse. They took the sanctuary I built, working overtime as a trauma nurse, and erased it. When my younger sister raised her champagne flute to toast my so-called sacrifice, the room erupted in applause. I did not flip the table. I did not scream. I looked my father in the eye, smiled, and whispered a single word before walking out into the cold. Before I tell you how I dismantled their pristine country club lives, take a second to hit that like button, subscribe to Sister Revenge, and drop a comment telling me your age and where you are watching from right now. The scent of roasted turkey and expensive Cabernet hung heavy in the dining room. I sat near the far end of the table, staring at an untouched plate. My oversized wool sweater felt heavy, the coarse fabric brushing against the raised healing incisions tracking across my abdomen. I was still weak, relying on painkillers just to sit upright. I assumed the worst ordeal of my life was behind me. Hector stood at the head of the table. My father smoothed the lapels of his tailored blazer, adopting the practiced smile he reserved for his wealthy peers. The room quieted. Aunts, uncles, and cousins turned their attention toward him. "This year has tested our strength," Hector began, his voice carrying a warm theatricality. "We almost lost our Drusilla." He paused, letting the somber silence settle over the room. He gestured in my direction, though his eyes avoided mine. "But the Rivera family protects its own," he continued. "When the medical bills began piling up during her hospitalization, Patricia and I had to make a difficult choice. We navigated the hurdle. We successfully sold Drusilla's townhouse. The equity cleared her debts, ensuring she can recover without a dark cloud hanging over her future." Beside my mother, my 26-year-old sister Isabella rose to her feet. The family golden child, a luxury wedding planner draped in a flawless silk dress, raised her glass. "To Drusilla," Isabella said, her voice wavering with practiced emotion, "your sacrifice means everything to us. We are just so glad you are safe." To Drusilla, the room echoed in a unified chorus. Silverware clattered as 50 relatives applauded, beaming with pride at my parents' heroic intervention. I sat paralyzed. My mind struggled to process the cheerful words bouncing off the walls. They had not asked me. They had not warned me. I purchased that brick townhouse 4 years ago. I saved every overtime paycheck. I painted the walls myself. And while I lay unconscious in an intensive care unit, the people who raised me liquidated my life work. The applause began to fade into a polite murmur. They waited for my tearful speech of gratitude. They expected me to play the role of the humble, rescued daughter. The initial shock evaporated. A cold, pristine clarity took its place. My pulse drummed a slow, steady rhythm against my jaw. I looked down the length of the table, past the imported floral centerpiece, straight into Hector's expectant gaze. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. Standing up, I wrapped my arms around my waist to support my healing core. I offered my father a faint, chilling smile. "Good," I whispered. The single syllable dropped into the silence like a stone. Before anyone could ask what I meant, I turned and walked out the front door, stepping into the freezing night. Why did I say good instead of fighting back right then? To understand the depth of the theft, you have to rewind the clock exactly 6 weeks. I am a specialized trauma intensive care nurse. My life was defined by the relentless rhythm of heart monitors, the sharp scent of antiseptic, and grueling 14-hour shifts pulling shattered people back from the brink. I knew how to navigate chaos. I knew how to stabilize a crashing patient. But nothing in my medical training prepared me for the calculated, quiet dismantling of my own existence. 6 weeks prior to that Thanksgiving dinner, I was driving home after a brutal double shift at a Fairfax hospital. A sudden torrential downpour turned Interstate 66 into a slick, hazardous corridor. A commercial semi-truck merged blindly into my lane. The crushing impact of grinding metal and shattered safety glass sent my sedan spiraling into the concrete median. The blunt force trauma caused severe internal hemorrhaging. Paramedics pulled me from the wreckage, and my own colleagues received me in the trauma bay. To save my life and allow my battered organs to heal, the surgical team placed me in a medically induced coma. I remained trapped in that silent, artificial slumber for 4 agonizing weeks. I woke up disoriented, a breathing tube scraping my throat, staring at the sterile ceiling tiles of my own workplace. I survived a catastrophic accident, considering myself lucky to be alive. I had no idea that those 4 weeks of missing time served as the perfect, uninterrupted incubator for my parents to execute a meticulous financial heist. The biting November wind whipped across the dark asphalt as I parked my rented sedan outside my Alexandria townhouse. The Thanksgiving feast I had just walked away from felt like a bizarre hallucination. I killed the engine and sat in the quiet car shivering in my oversized sweater. The residual pain from my injuries throbbed a steady warning rhythm across my abdomen. All I wanted was the familiar comfort of my own bed, the walls I painted myself, and the hardwood floors I installed on my hands and knees using my hazard pay. I walked up the short concrete pathway, my boots crunching softly on the frost-covered leaves. I reached into my coat pocket for my heavy brass key. When I looked up, the betrayal transitioned from a spoken dinner announcement into a stark physical barrier. The heavy brass deadbolt I relied on for security was gone. In its place sat a sleek, modern digital keypad with a glowing blue interface. I stood on the welcome mat, staring at the synthetic light. I reached out my fingers, trembling in the cold air, and pressed the handle. It held firm. I punched in a random sequence of numbers, desperate for a mechanical glitch, but a harsh red light flashed, accompanied by a low, rejecting beep. I was an exiled ghost, standing on my own front porch. Panic, cold and sharp, began to flood my chest. I retreated to the safety of my car, slamming the door shut to block out the freezing wind. I turned the ignition, blasting the heater to stop my teeth from chattering. I pulled my smartphone from my purse, my thumbs clumsy and stiff as I navigated to my primary banking application. My parents claimed they sold the house to clear my medical debt, a convenient narrative meant to generate sympathy from our extended relatives. I needed to see the numbers. I typed my password and waited for the loading screen to clear. The screen did not display my familiar savings balance. Instead, a stark red banner spanned the top of the interface. Account frozen. Please contact your local branch administrator. I tapped the screen, trying to refresh the page. I switched to my secondary checking account, the place where I hoarded my overtime bonuses. Frozen. My credit card portals displayed identical error messages. Hector and Patricia had not just changed the locks on my front door. They had systematically severed my access to every single dollar I had ever earned. They restricted my financial oxygen, leaving me stranded in the cold with a healing body and an empty wallet. Desperation pushed me to act. I dialed the local Alexandria police dispatch. I sat in the idling car, watching my breath plume in the dim streetlights, waiting for a patrol cruiser to arrive. 10 minutes later, the sweeping blue and red lights painted the brick facades of the quiet neighborhood. A uniformed officer stepped out of the cruiser, his duty belt jingling softly in the silent street. I rolled down my window, handing him my driver license and explaining the situation. I told him my house was stolen while I was in a hospital bed. I told him strangers had changed my locks. The officer listened patiently, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He took my identification back to his cruiser, sitting behind his illuminated laptop to run the property records through the county database. I waited, gripping the steering wheel, praying for a swift eviction of the trespassers and the return of my keys. When the officer returned to my window, his demeanor had shifted from helpful concern to guarded bureaucratic detachment. He handed my license back, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the officer said, his voice clipped and formal. "I cannot force entry into that residence. According to the county clerk registry, the deed to this property was legally transferred 3 weeks ago. The current occupants are the lawful owners of record." I stared at him, my pulse hammering against my ribs. "I did not sign a deed," I told him, my voice cracking under the strain. "I was in a coma. My parents forged the sale. You have to arrest them." The officer sighed, resting his hand on the roof of my car. "The state registry shows a durable power of attorney on file. Because your mother was listed as your emergency medical proxy, the state recognized her authority to execute financial transactions on your behalf while you were incapacitated. To the Commonwealth of Virginia, the paperwork is clean." He leaned down, looking me in the eye with a trace of genuine pity. "I cannot intervene. This is a civil family dispute. You need to hire a lawyer and take this up in a courtroom. If you try to force your way through that front door tonight, I will have to arrest you for trespassing." The words struck me like a physical blow. A civil family dispute. The legal system did not view me as the victim of a sophisticated robbery. The law viewed me as a disgruntled daughter, unhappy with a legitimate administrative decision. The officer wished me luck, returned to his cruiser, and drove away. The taillights faded around the corner, leaving me plunged back into the profound, suffocating silence of the neighborhood. I turned off the car engine to conserve my dwindling fuel. The temperature inside the cabin began to plummet. I rested my forehead against the cold leather of the steering wheel. I was 29 years old. I spent my days pulling crushed bodies out of the jaws of death, yet I possessed no ability to save myself. I had nowhere to sleep. I had no money to buy a warm meal. My own flesh and blood traded my security for a quick payout, assuming my exhaustion would force me to quietly absorb the loss. But as the initial wave of despair washed over me, a sharp analytical instinct began to spark in the back of my mind. My training as an intensive care nurse demanded a forensic evaluation of the trauma. You diagnose the source of the bleeding before you stitch the wound. I lifted my head, staring at the dark windows of my stolen townhouse. The officer mentioned a durable power of attorney. The explanation sounded neat and official on a dark street corner, but it defied the rigorous reality of high-level real estate transactions. Title companies manage the transfer of hundreds of thousands of dollars. They are notoriously paranoid institutions driven by strict liability and compliance protocols. A standard escrow agent does not just accept a generic strip mall notary stamp to liquidate a $250,000 asset without demanding rigorous, undeniable verification from the principal owner. My parents were wealthy, image-obsessed suburbanites, not seasoned corporate fraudsters. They did not possess the legal sophistication to pull off a flawless blind closing on their own. They had to bypass the ironclad underwriting protocols of a licensed title agency, while I lay trapped in a medically induced slumber. The lock on my front door was changed, but the true barrier was the invisible mountain of paperwork they somehow managed to manipulate. How did Patricia and Hector acquire the specific, verified medical authorization required to legally blind a title company? I put the rented sedan in drive, forcing my stiff fingers to grip the steering wheel. The glowing blue keypad of my stolen townhouse faded into the rearview mirror, swallowed by the freezing Virginia night. I navigated the empty highways toward Arlington, finally parking outside a weathered, 3-story apartment complex. Maya, a fellow trauma nurse who frequently shared my grueling night shifts, answered the door at 2 a.m. She took one look at my pale face, asked 0 questions, and pointed toward her living room. I collapsed onto her faux leather sofa. The worn springs dug mercilessly into my back, aggravating the fresh surgical incisions across my abdomen. I pulled a thin fleece blanket over my shoulders, shivering as the adrenaline slowly drained from my system. The physical sting of the winter wind was gone, but it was quickly replaced by a terrifying, cold, logistical puzzle. When the sun rose, casting a gray, overcast light through the apartment blinds, I borrowed Maya's laptop. I sat at her tiny kitchen table, nursing a mug of bitter black coffee. If I wanted to reclaim my life, I had to dissect the anatomy of the theft. I started dialing. I navigated the labyrinth of county clerk offices, state registries, and local escrow agencies. Real estate transactions are bureaucratic fortresses. Title companies operate on a foundation of strict compliance and intense liability avoidance. A simple notarized piece of paper downloaded from the internet does not compel an underwriter to authorize the transfer of a valuable property. Escrow agents demand concrete, verified proof when dealing with an incapacitated owner. They require formal medical affidavits to ensure they are not participating in a crime. My parents did not possess the legal brilliance to outsmart a seasoned title agent on their own. They needed an inside key. The obstacle blocking my path to justice was my mother and her extensive country club network. Patricia Rivera spent decades cultivating a pristine social facade. She hosted charity luncheons, organized silent auctions, and meticulously collected favors from the affluent elite of Fairfax County. She viewed relationships as transactional currency. I finally managed to coax a sympathetic clerk at the county records office into emailing me a scanned copy of the deed transfer attachments. I opened the document file, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. I found the exact instrument my parents used to bypass the strict underwriting protocols. It was a formal declaration of incapacity. My pulse hammered a slow, furious rhythm against my ribs as I read the signature at the bottom of the page. The document was not signed by the trauma surgeon who operated on me. It was not authorized by the chief resident of the intensive care unit where I lay comatose for 4 weeks. The signature belonged to a highly paid private concierge physician who frequently shared a golf cart with my father. This man never stepped foot inside my hospital room. He never reviewed my charts. He never assessed my neurological function. He simply stamped his medical credentials onto a fraudulent affidavit as a quiet favor to his wealthy friends. Armed with that fake medical declaration, Patricia and Hector transformed my temporary tragedy into their permanent financial gain. I scrolled down to the final page of the settlement statement. When my eyes landed on the closing numbers, the sheer malice of the transaction left me breathless. The Alexandria townhouse had appraised for $280,000 just a year prior. My parents sold it for $150,000. They surrendered $130,000 of my hard-earned equity. To a rational observer, selling a prime piece of Northern Virginia real estate for pennies on the dollar makes zero financial sense. But looking through the lens of a calculated heist, the math revealed a terrifying strategy. My parents needed the sale to close before I woke up from my coma. Traditional buyers require standard mortgages. Banks send out independent appraisers, demand lengthy inspections, and ask uncomfortable questions that slow down the timeline. A deep discount attracts cash buyers. Cash bypasses the traditional banking hurdles, allowing for an expedited 30-day closing window. They sacrificed half the value of my home just to secure an immediate, untraceable payout before my eyes opened. I closed the laptop, the bright glow of the screen burning my tired eyes. The silence of the cramped apartment felt heavy, pressing down on my shoulders. I was 29 years old. I spent 5 years saving hazard pay and working double shifts to build a safety net. In the span of a single month, my parents engineered an impenetrable legal fortress designed specifically to starve me into silent, obedient submission. I picked up my smartphone, checking my bank balance one more time, hoping for a clerical error. The screen displayed a meager $200 in an unlinked savings account. The rest of my funds remained frozen under the power of attorney. I could not afford to buy a hot meal or fill my gas tank, let alone hire a professional to dismantle my parents' conspiracy. I spent the afternoon calling real estate litigators in the downtown district. I explained the forged medical documents and the discounted cash sale. Every polished receptionist offered the same sympathetic sigh, followed by the same impossible toll. A minimum $15,000 retainer was required just to review the file and file an initial injunction. My parents knew my financial habits. They knew I poured every spare dollar into the principal of my mortgage. By locking my accounts and stealing the equity, they effectively cut off my oxygen supply. They expected me to realize that fighting them was a mathematical impossibility. They anticipated that I would crawl back to their sprawling estate, beg for forgiveness for walking out of Thanksgiving dinner, and quietly accept my role as the sacrificial lamb. I sat on the lumpy faux leather couch, rationing cheap ibuprofen to dull the ache in my surgical scars. The physical isolation was daunting, but I still possessed my career. I still held a specialized nursing license that guaranteed I could eventually rebuild my life, even from scratch. I planned to contact the hospital administration the next morning, secure an advance on my upcoming shifts, and slowly climb my way out of the financial grave my parents dug for me. I believed the worst of their attack was over. I assumed stealing my home was the ultimate boundary they were willing to cross. I was profoundly wrong. The financial chokehold was merely the opening maneuver in a much larger, more destructive war. As I stared at my drained bank account, calculating how many days I could survive on leftover pasta, my smartphone screen illuminated with a flurry of incoming notifications. I did not know it yet, but a devastating preemptive strike was already hurtling toward me, orchestrated by the sister I supposedly sacrificed everything to save. What insidious lie was Isabella preparing to launch to ensure I never stood back up? The screen of my smartphone illuminated the dim, quiet living room, casting a harsh blue glow across the faux leather cushions. The device vibrated against the cheap veneer of the coffee table, emitting a relentless, rhythmic buzzing. I stared at it, my heart rate quickening. A single notification is a message. A dozen notifications in the span of 30 seconds is a coordinated assault. I reached out, my fingers stiff and cold, and picked up the phone. The lock screen was buried under a cascading waterfall of text messages. They were not alerts from my bank or updates from the police. They were messages from my own blood. Aunts, uncles, and cousins from across the eastern seaboard were flooding a newly created group chat. I unlocked the screen and opened the thread. The words waiting for me were laced with a toxic, suffocating blend of pity and judgment. Aunt Elena sent a digital illustration of praying hands. We are surrounding you with healing light. Drusilla, her message read, surrender to the process. There is no shame in seeking rehabilitation. My cousin David followed immediately. We are all rooting for your recovery. Do not push the family away. Mom and Dad did what they had to do to save your life. I blinked, the exhaustion momentarily clouding my vision. Rehabilitation, recovery, saving my life. The phrases made zero sense. I had been in a catastrophic car accident, suffering from blunt force trauma and internal bleeding. I was a patient, not an addict. I scrolled up to the very beginning of the thread to find the source of the sudden, bizarre outpouring of familial concern. Resting at the top of the group chat was a lengthy, meticulously crafted paragraph from my 26-year-old sister. Isabella was a luxury wedding planner who catered to the affluent elite of the Washington metropolitan area. Her entire existence revolved around optics curation and the flawless presentation of a curated reality. She spent her days managing bridal crises, smoothing over unsightly blemishes, and spinning disasters into beautiful, digestible narratives for her pristine social media feeds. Now she was applying her formidable public relations skills to our family dynamic. Please keep Drusilla in your prayers tonight, Isabella wrote, her tone dripping with manufactured heartbreak. The trauma of her terrible car crash was too much for her to handle. She has been struggling with a severe drug-induced mental breakdown. The heavy painkillers changed her. Mom and Dad had to make the agonizing decision to sell her townhouse to fund an involuntary psychiatric stay. She walked out of Thanksgiving dinner because she is unstable and refusing treatment. We are heartbroken, but we have to employ tough love. I sat frozen on the lumpy couch, reading the paragraph 3 times. The air in the cramped apartment felt incredibly thin. This was the pebble of conflict, a sharp, stinging betrayal that struck with breathtaking precision. Isabella did not just invent a petty rumor. She launched a ruthless, calculated smear campaign designed to obliterate my credibility. She weaponized our massive extended family, utilizing their religious guilt and their inherent trust in my parents to paint me as a deranged, spiraling addict. My thumbs hovered over the digital keyboard. My first instinct, fueled by a surge of raw indignation, was to fight back. I wanted to type a furious response, to attach photographs of my hospital discharge papers, to scream into the digital void that I was sober, sane, and the victim of a sophisticated financial heist. But my training as a trauma nurse kicked in, overriding the panic. You do not treat a symptom without understanding the underlying disease. I lowered the phone, the cold light illuminating the stark reality of the situation. Isabella was not acting alone, and this was not mere family gossip. This was a strategic, preemptive legal defense. This was the boulder. To legitimize a forged power of attorney and a fraudulent declaration of medical incapacity, my parents needed more than just a shady doctor signature. They needed a solid, impenetrable public narrative. If I somehow managed to scrape together enough cash to hire a litigator and challenge the sale of my townhouse in a civil courtroom, Hector and Patricia would need witnesses. Isabella had just recruited an army of them. By convincing 50 extended relatives that I had suffered a psychotic break, my sister insulated our parents from any criminal suspicion. If a judge or an investigator ever asked questions, the entire Rivera family would step forward in unison. They would testify that Hector and Patricia were not thieves, but tragic, loving parents executing a desperate intervention to save their troubled daughter. The sudden, uncharacteristic liquidation of my assets would be framed as a necessary medical expense. My parents gleefully corroborated the lie. As I scrolled further down the chat, I saw my mother responding to the outpouring of support. "Thank you all," Patricia typed, adding a weeping emoji. "Our hearts are shattered, but we must protect her from herself. Please give us privacy during this dark chapter." They sacrificed my professional and personal reputation without a second thought. They threw my character into a wood chipper to shield their favorite daughter's pristine image and to secure their stolen equity. They assumed my physical exhaustion, combined with the crushing shame of being branded an addict, would force me to surrender. They believed the social excommunication would break my spirit before I ever reached the steps of a courthouse. The psychological warfare was remarkably effective. The isolation settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I could not call my aunts for a temporary loan. I could not ask my cousins to let me sleep on their guest beds. The family network, the safety net I had known my entire life, was permanently severed. I was an exiled pariah. I set the smartphone face down on the coffee table. Defending myself in that group chat would only make me appear more erratic, playing directly into the unstable persona Isabella had carefully crafted for me. Let them believe the lie I told myself in the quiet dark of the apartment. Let them think I am broken. Trauma nurses know how to triage a disaster. You assess the damage, you accept the amputations, and you focus entirely on the vital organs that remain. The family was gone. The house was gone. The savings were gone. But I still possessed my mind. I still possessed my specialized education and my unblemished work history. My nursing license was the one untouchable asset my family could not liquidate. I could contact the hospital administration, request an early return to light duty, and start picking up extra shifts. It would take years of grueling labor to rebuild the $250,000 they stole, but I could do it. I could survive the exile as long as I could work. I pulled the thin fleece blanket tighter around my shoulders, preparing to endure a few weeks of poverty while waiting for my next paycheck. I believed I had identified the lowest point of the valley. I assumed Patricia had achieved her ultimate goal by turning our relatives against me. I profoundly underestimated the depths of my mother cruelty. Hector and Patricia knew exactly how resilient I was. They knew I had survived brutal emergency room shifts and relentless pressure. They realized that merely stealing my home and ruining my reputation among a circle of gossiping aunts would not keep me down forever. To ensure my complete financial destruction, to guarantee I could never afford a lawyer to uncover their fraud, they had to sever my final lifeline. As the sun began to rise over the dreary Arlington skyline, an automated email landed in my professional inbox, signaling a direct, lethal strike on my career. The lie Isabella planted in the family group chat was about to breach the digital walls of our household and land on the desk of a state licensing investigator. How far would Patricia go to guarantee I remained permanently destitute? The gray morning light filtered through the cheap vinyl blinds of Maya's living room, casting long, dull shadows across the faux leather sofa. I woke up with a stiff neck and a familiar throbbing ache radiating from my surgical incisions. I pushed the thin fleece blanket aside and sat up, rubbing my tired eyes. The apartment was quiet. Maya had already left for her morning shift at the hospital, leaving a pot of coffee warming on the kitchen counter. I poured myself a mug and carried it back to the coffee table, opening my laptop. I told myself the worst of the storm had passed. The family group chat was muted, the house was gone, and my bank accounts remained frozen, but I still possessed my mind and my work ethic. I planned to email my nursing supervisor, request clearance to return to light-duty desk work, and begin the slow, grueling process of earning my life back, one hourly wage at a time. I opened my professional email inbox. Sitting at the very top of the screen was a message from the Virginia Board of Nursing. My stomach dropped, leaving a hollow, aching void beneath my ribs. State licensing boards do not send casual weekend updates. They send official mandates, compliance audits, and disciplinary actions. I clicked the subject line, my finger trembling against the trackpad. The digital text blurred for a fraction of a second before my brain forced my eyes to focus on the clinical, unforgiving terminology. The email was a formal notice of an emergency administrative suspension. According to the board, an anonymous, concerned family member had submitted a detailed ethics complaint regarding my fitness to practice medicine. The complaint alleged that following a severe highway collision, I had developed a profound dependency on prescription narcotics and was suffering from a severe, untreated mental breakdown. The state of Virginia takes allegations of impaired medical practitioners with utmost seriousness. A trauma nurse holds the lives of vulnerable patients in her hands. If a nurse is accused of charting medications while under the influence, the board must act to protect the public. However, accusations usually require substantial proof before triggering an immediate suspension. I scrolled down to the bottom of the email. There was an attached portable document format file labeled Exhibit A. I clicked the icon. The document opened displaying the exact same fraudulent declaration of incapacity that my parents had used to sell my Alexandria townhouse. The pristine, official-looking letterhead of my father's concierge doctor stared back at me, bearing the forged signature that declared me medically incompetent. The air rushed out of my lungs. I gripped the edge of the coffee table, my knuckles turning stark white. Patricia did not just plant a vicious rumor in a family text thread to save face with our aunts and uncles. She weaponized state bureaucracy. She took the fake medical affidavit she purchased to steal my real estate and mailed it directly to the governing body that controlled my livelihood. She used the power of the state to validate her lie. The email concluded with a cold, non-negotiable directive. Effective immediately, my registered nursing license was suspended, pending a full, invasive psychological and medical investigation. I was legally barred from stepping foot inside any clinical setting, forbidden from contacting my patients, and stripped of my ability to earn a paycheck. My income flatlined in a single instant. This was not a minor inconvenience. This was a lethal, calculated strike aimed directly at the foundation of my survival. I spent years earning that specialized certification. I worked night shifts to pay my tuition studying anatomy textbooks in cramped hospital break rooms, sacrificing holidays and weekends to build an unblemished professional record. I survived the chaos of the intensive care unit, earning the deep respect of trauma surgeons and fellow nurses. My career was my identity, my pride, and my sole source of independence. With one forged piece of paper, my own mother erased a decade of grueling labor. The defense strategy my parents deployed became agonizingly clear. It was a textbook, ruthless siege. Hector and Patricia knew I was stubborn. They knew that if I possessed a steady paycheck, I would eventually save enough money to hire a real estate litigator, subpoena the title company, and uncover the illegal straw purchase of my home. To prevent me from ever reaching the steps of a courthouse, they had to cut off my oxygen supply. By severing my nursing income and freezing my remaining personal assets under the fraudulent power of attorney, they engineered a scenario where I could not even afford a bus pass, let alone a seasoned trial attorney. They aimed to bankrupt me, breaking my spirit and starving me into silent, obedient submission. The sheer malice of their calculation paralyzed me. I closed the laptop, the screen going dark. The quiet hum of the apartment refrigerator sounded deafening in the silence. The next 3 days dissolved into a blur of raw, physical despair. I was a ghost haunting my friend's living room. I counted the leftover coffee pods, skipping meals to stretch the few cans of soup Maya kept in her pantry. I felt a profound, suffocating shame for imposing on her hospitality, knowing I had no timeline for when I could offer a single dollar for rent. The physical toll of my healing body compounded the psychological torment. Without medical insurance, which was tied directly to my suspended hospital employment, I could not afford to refill my prescription painkillers or schedule my necessary follow-up appointments. The surgical incisions across my abdomen burned with a hot, persistent ache. I lay on the lumpy faux leather sofa, staring at the popcorn ceiling, feeling the cold reality of my situation settling into my bones. I checked my primary banking app one final time. The screen displayed a sterile balance of $42. I stared at an unpaid auto insurance bill and a formal notice from my cell phone provider threatening to disconnect my service. I hit absolute rock bottom. The fight drained out of my system, replaced by a heavy, hollow exhaustion. The legal fortress my parents built was too tall, the walls too thick, and I possessed no weapons to breach the gates. They held my reputation, my house, and my career hostage. I realized with a sickening clarity that the only way to lift the suspension on my nursing license was to offer them the unconditional surrender they demanded. I pulled my phone to my chest, my hands shaking. I opened a blank text message and typed my father's phone number into the recipient bar. My vision blurred with hot, stinging tears. I swallowed my pride, preparing to draft a message, begging for a truce. I was ready to concede the stolen equity in exchange for a retraction of the ethics complaint. I was ready to wave the white flag and accept my role as the defeated, exiled daughter, just to get my life back. My thumb hovered over the digital keyboard, trembling, as I prepared to type the words, "You win." Before my finger could strike the glass screen, a heavy, commanding rhythm echoed through the quiet apartment. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks struck the wooden front door. The sound was not the hesitant, polite tap of a delivery driver, or the familiar jingle of Maya returning home from her shift. It was an authoritative, unyielding strike that demanded immediate attention. It was the sound of someone who did not wait for invitations. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I lowered the phone, the drafted text message of surrender glowing brightly in the dim room. I forced myself to stand, wincing as my core muscles protested the movement. I walked slowly toward the entryway, my bare feet silent on the cheap carpet. I reached the door and pressed my eye against the small glass peephole, wondering what new disaster Hector and Patricia had dispatched to my doorstep. I pressed my eye against the small glass lens of the front door. The distorted, curved view revealed a figure standing in the narrow apartment hallway. It was not a delivery driver dropping off a package. It was not my father arriving to demand my final surrender. It was Grandpa Mateo. Mateo Rivera was 78 years old, but age had not softened his edges. He spent 4 decades operating as a senior forensic auditor for the Internal Revenue Service. He built a formidable career dismantling organized crime syndicates, tracking hidden offshore accounts, and sending wealthy tax evaders to federal prison. He survived in a world of deception by adhering to a strict diet of relentless logic and cold arithmetic. He possessed zero tolerance for Hector and his image-obsessed parenting style. More importantly, Mateo saw right through the glamorous, hollow facade my sister Isabella projected to the outside world. I turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Matteo stood there wearing a crisp, tailored charcoal suit, leaning slightly on a polished wooden cane. The distinct scent of bitter black coffee and worn leather followed him inside. He did not reach out for a warm hug. He did not offer sympathetic tears or gentle words of comfort regarding my accident. He took one look at my pale face, my rumpled clothes, and the bleak surroundings of my friend Maya's cramped living room. "Close the door, Drusilla," he instructed. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that commanded instant obedience. I pushed the door shut, leaning my back against the wood as my grandfather walked past me. He moved toward the cheap coffee table, his cane tapping a steady, rhythmic beat against the floorboards. His sharp eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on my smartphone. The screen was still glowing brightly, displaying the unsent text message of surrender I had prepared for my father just moments before. Matteo did not comment on my moment of weakness. Instead, he reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket. He extracted a crisp, folded piece of paper. With a swift, deliberate motion, he slammed the document onto the table. The sound cracked like a whip in the silent apartment. I stepped forward, my eyes drawn to the paper resting on the faux wood veneer. It was a certified cashier check drawn from a federal credit union. The printed amount read $25,000. The air rushed out of my lungs. I stared at the numbers, my brain struggling to process the visual information. $25,000 was not just a generous family gift. It was war capital. It was the exact amount required to retain a high-tier legal team, secure expert witnesses, and fight a drawn-out battle in a civil courtroom. "Where did this come from?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Matteo rested both hands on the silver handle of his cane. "I prepared for this 6 months ago," he stated. His tone shifted the entire atmosphere of the room. The oppressive, suffocating weight of my isolation began to crack. I looked at him, confusion mixing with a sudden dizzying rush of hope. 6 months ago, I was healthy. I was working my hospital shifts, living in my Alexandria townhouse, unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon. My parents had not stolen anything yet. "You diagnose the disease before the patient shows symptoms," Matteo explained, reading my mind. "Last May, your mother hosted a spring garden party at the estate. Everyone was drinking mimosas and praising Isabella for booking another high-profile wedding. But I watch numbers, Drusilla. I do not watch smiles." Matteo paced slowly toward the narrow window, peering out at the overcast Arlington sky. He detailed the crucial pebble that triggered his suspicion. At that party, Isabella was wearing a brand-new, diamond-encrusted Cartier watch on her wrist, he recalled, a piece of jewelry that retails for $15,000. Yet during that same afternoon, I watched her reject 4 consecutive phone calls on her cell phone. She stepped into the hallway, her face pale, and whispered to a frustrated florist that payment would be delayed another week. A successful businesswoman wearing Cartier does not dodge panicked calls from local vendors over a few $100s. His forensic instincts had flared instantly. Over the next 6 months, Matteo utilized his network of retired federal contacts to quietly track her financial footprint. He examined public records, scrutinized her business filings, and observed the widening gap between her curated social media wealth and her actual liquidity. He knew she was drowning in a hidden crisis. He knew the golden child was building a fragile house of cards, and he knew Hector would cross any ethical line to catch her when she inevitably fell. When the Thanksgiving dinner happened, Matteo continued, turning back to face me. "And your father announced the sale of your home." The math finally aligned. They needed untraceable cash to cover whatever hole your sister dug for herself. They used your accident as the perfect cover to generate those funds. I stood frozen, absorbing the horrifying reality that my grandfather had predicted my ruin simply by observing my sister and her unyielding greed. But Matteo was not finished. He did not just bring a check to fund my defense. He brought the executioner. Matteo turned toward the apartment entryway. "You can come in now," he called out. The front door, which had remained slightly ajar, swung open. A woman stepped over the threshold, bringing a sudden electric energy into the cramped space. She wore a pristine navy blue skirt suit and carried a structured leather briefcase. Her posture was flawless, her gaze calculating and predatory. Matteo gestured toward her. "Drusilla, meet Evelyn Cross," he said. "She is a senior partner at a downtown real estate litigation firm. She specializes in dismantling fraudulent corporate transactions, and she does not take prisoners." Evelyn offered a brief professional nod. She did not offer pity or gentle condolences. She surveyed the room with the cold detachment of a general mapping a battlefield. She walked over to the coffee table and set her heavy briefcase down next to the cashier check. "Let us get to work," Evelyn said, her voice crisp and uncompromising. "We have a title company to subpoena." The dynamic flipped in a matter of seconds. The crushing despair that had paralyzed me all morning vanished, replaced by a sharp, burning focus. I picked up my smartphone, deleted the drafted message of surrender, and turned the device off. I was no longer a desperate nurse fighting a defensive war from a borrowed couch. I was a heavily funded plaintiff launching a surgical strike. With a shark attorney and a veteran IRS investigator operating on my side, what terrifying secret would we uncover first? Evelyn Cross did not waste a single hour on polite family mediation. She operated with the swift, lethal precision of a predator who had just caught the scent of blood. We relocated from the cramped Arlington apartment to her expansive corner office in downtown Washington. The room featured floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the Potomac River, projecting an aura of intimidating, unyielding power. Sitting across from her vast mahogany desk, I watched Evelyn draft the initial discovery motions. She did not bother sending warning letters or attempting to negotiate a settlement with my parents. She went straight for the jugular. She filed relentless subpoenas in civil court, legally compelling the Virginia Title Company to surrender the unredacted closing documents from my townhouse sale. She demanded every email, every wire transfer receipt, and every stamped affidavit associated with the transaction. While we waited for the escrow agency to comply with the court order, my mind kept drifting back to the Thanksgiving dinner. I remembered the booming, theatrical tone of Hector's voice as he addressed our 50 extended relatives. During his speech, my father proudly claimed that he and Patricia had sold my property to a struggling young veteran family. It was a brilliant, highly calculated red herring. Hector knew I spent my 12-hour shifts treating injured service members in the trauma ward. He understood my deep, unwavering respect for veterans. By planting that specific detail into his public narrative, he engineered a psychological trap designed to suppress my anger. He wanted me to feel a sharp twinge of guilt for contesting the sale. He wanted me to picture a deserving, hard-working family unpacking their belongings in my living room, making me look petty and cruel if I demanded my keys back. It was a masterful manipulation of my own moral compass, crafted to keep me compliant and silent. Evelyn shattered that carefully constructed illusion on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in her leather guest chair when a courier arrived with a thick, sealed cardboard box from the title company. Evelyn sliced the packing tape with a silver letter opener, the sound sharp in the quiet office. She pulled out a towering stack of dense legal paperwork, her eyes scanning the pages with rapid, practiced efficiency. She did not show surprise. She simply pulled a single sheet of paper from the middle of the stack and slid it across the polished desk toward me. Evelyn instructed me to read the buyer identification line on the final settlement statement. I leaned forward, my eyes tracing the black ink printed on the crisp white page. The document did not list the names of a young veteran couple. The buyer was listed as Nova Holdings Limited Liability Company. The revelation hit me like a sudden drop in cabin pressure. My property was not sold to an innocent, anonymous family seeking a starter home. It was swallowed by a faceless, corporate shell entity. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. She explained that shell companies are frequently utilized in real estate to mask the true identity of the purchaser. They hide behind registered agents and generic post office box addresses, providing a convenient cloak of anonymity for individuals who do not want their names attached to a specific transaction. But Evelyn made a career out of tearing down those exact cloaks. She reached into a separate manila folder on her desk and extracted a certified printout from the State Corporation Commission. She placed it right next to the settlement statement. "Look at the formation date," Evelyn directed, tapping her manicured finger against the top corner of the registry document. I checked the timeline. Nova Holdings was officially incorporated exactly 3 days after my sedan was crushed on Interstate 66. The sheer cold-blooded nature of the timeline sent a chill down my spine. While I was lying in a hospital bed, hooked to a mechanical ventilator and fighting for my life, the people I trusted most were filing expedited corporate paperwork with the state of Virginia. They were laying the foundation for a financial heist before the bruises on my skin even had a chance to darken. Evelyn then pointed to the bottom of the state registry page. The document listed a single managing member wielding total executive control over the shell company. The name printed on the line was Julian. My breath caught in my throat. Julian was the slick, polished fiancé of my sister Isabella. He was a man who wore custom-tailored suits paid for by my parents and spent his weekday afternoons sipping expensive espresso at upscale coffee shops. He constantly pitched vague tech startups and venture capital ideas that never materialized into actual businesses. He possessed the smooth, practiced charm of a professional parasite, contributing zero discernible income to their relationship while riding comfortably in the passenger seat of Isabella's curated luxury lifestyle. The entire Thanksgiving narrative of a desperate medical crisis evaporated, exposing a terrifying, undeniable truth. Hector and Patricia did not panic and sell my home to strangers in a frantic bid to cover mounting hospital bills. They actively conspired to execute a textbook predatory straw purchase. By using the forged power of attorney to sell my $280,000 property for a mere $150,000 to a corporate entity controlled by their future son-in-law, they orchestrated a massive transfer of wealth. They effectively gifted $130,000 of my unearned equity directly to Isabella and Julian. I stared at Julian's name on the paper, a profound, searing anger replacing the lingering exhaustion in my body. Every overtime shift I worked, every holiday I spent away from home, every drop of sweat I poured into laying the hardwood floors of that townhouse had been stolen. My parents stripped my hard-earned wealth to artificially enrich their golden child and her idle partner. They used my medical vulnerability as a convenient smokescreen to launder real estate right under my nose. The conflict was no longer a simple betrayal of familial trust. It was a premeditated, coordinated financial crime perpetrated by the people who raised me. I looked up at Evelyn, my jaw set tight. We had uncovered the buyer, the method, and the timeline. But as I processed the staggering audacity of the straw purchase, a new glaring inconsistency began to gnaw at the back of my mind. Julian was undeniably greedy, but he was also notoriously lazy. Setting up a corporate shell company, coordinating a blind cash closing with a title agency, and securing the funds to purchase a house required a level of desperate, frantic urgency that did not align with his usual idle behavior. The golden couple went to extraordinary lengths to mask the transaction, hiding the equity transfer behind corporate veils and fabricated stories about struggling veterans. People who are simply greedy do not usually panic and rush a real estate closing in 30 days. People who are running out of time do. Why did Isabella and Julian need to hide behind an anonymous limited liability company to steal my money? What impending catastrophic disaster were they trying to outrun by forcing my parents to generate untraceable cash so quickly? I sat in Evelyn Cross' corner office, staring at the state registry document. The name Julian glared back at me, printed in stark black ink. Before I could voice my questions out loud, the heavy glass door swung open. Grandpa Mateo walked in. He leaned on his polished wooden cane, carrying a worn leather briefcase that looked like a relic from his days at the Internal Revenue Service. Mateo did not bother with pleasantries. He took a seat next to me, unclasped the brass buckles of his briefcase, and pulled out a thick stack of financial ledgers. Evelyn had utilized her legal authority to pierce the corporate veil of the real estate transaction. Mateo had spent the last 48 hours utilizing his vast network of retired federal contacts to tear through the rotting core of Isabella's luxury wedding planning business. He placed the papers on the mahogany desk. The documents smelled of stale ink and old filing cabinets. Isabella catered to the affluent elite of Loudoun County and Great Falls. Her clients were local politicians, corporate executives, and heirs to generational wealth. These people expected flawless perfection, and they paid for it up front. A single wedding contract often required cash deposits exceeding $50,000 just to secure exclusive vineyards and high-end catering companies. Mateo slid a highlighted bank statement across the desk. Isabella was not just struggling with minor credit card debt or living slightly beyond her means. She was operating a sophisticated Ponzi scheme. For 14 months, she had been systematically embezzling client deposits. When a bride wired $30,000 to secure a country club ballroom, Isabella did not pay the venue. She illegally diverted those funds into her personal accounts. She used her clients' money to finance her own curated reality. The $15,000 Cartier watch, the imported silk dresses, the weekend trips to coastal resorts. Every single luxury item was funded by stolen bridal deposits. She survived by using the deposit from the next bride to pay the overdue vendors of the previous wedding. It was a stressful, precarious balancing act, relying entirely on a constant influx of new clients to keep the illusion afloat. But the music always stops. Mateo pointed a calloused finger at a specific date printed on the ledger. 3 weeks before my car accident, the scheme fractured. A prominent local family suspicious of delayed vendor payments and vague excuses demanded transparency. They hired an independent forensic accountant to audit the wedding budget. The auditor requested full, immediate access to Isabella business escrow accounts. She was out of time. The independent audit would reveal hundreds of thousands of dollars in missing funds. The paper trail led straight to federal wire fraud and grand larceny. Isabella was staring down the barrel of a lengthy sentence in a federal penitentiary. In a sheer, breathless panic, the golden child ran to our parents. Mateo described the scenario with chilling, clinical detachment. She sat in their sprawling estate, wept bitter tears, and confessed her crimes. My father and mother faced a terrifying dilemma. If Isabella went to prison, the Rivera family name would become a toxic punchline. The social scandal would obliterate the pristine reputation Hector spent decades cultivating among his peers. They needed to generate a huge sum of untraceable, liquid cash to secretly replace the stolen bridal funds before the auditors opened the books. They lacked the liquid capital themselves. Traditional bank loans require weeks of rigorous underwriting and endless paperwork. They were trapped. Then their other daughter was crushed by a commercial truck on Interstate 66. They received the phone call that I was in a medically induced coma. Hector and Patricia did not see a tragedy. They saw a lifeline. They viewed my unconscious, broken body as the perfect sacrificial lamb. They needed a disposable asset, and my life savings fit the exact dimensions of their crisis. My parents orchestrated the theft of my townhouse to save their golden child from handcuffs. They forged the medical documents, manipulated the title company, and expedited the 30-day cash closing to Julian Shell Company. They generated $150,000 from my unearned equity. They funneled that exact amount directly into Isabella business accounts, balancing her ledgers mere hours before the independent auditor arrived to inspect the finances. The realization settled over me, turning my blood to ice. My parents did not steal my home out of ignorance or misguided panic over my medical bills. They actively facilitated a sophisticated criminal cover-up. They willingly threw my honest, hard-earned life into a wood chipper to keep their thieving daughter out of a federal courtroom. They chose her freedom over my survival. I closed my eyes, feeling a deep, radiating ache in my surgical scars. I remembered the long, grueling night shifts at the hospital. I remembered holding the hands of terrified patients, earning my paycheck through blood and exhaustion. My sister earned her money by smiling at wealthy brides and stealing their deposits. Yet in the eyes of my parents, she was the child worth saving. I was simply the collateral damage required to keep her pristine image intact. Evelyn watched me process the betrayal. She did not offer empty sympathy. She simply tapped her pen against the mahogany desk, drawing my attention back to the battlefield. We now possessed the motive, Evelyn stated, her voice sharp and focused. We had the wire fraud, the forged signatures, and the paper trail linking the stolen real estate equity directly to the bridal embezzlement. The civil case was already won. The evidence sitting on the desk was enough to void the property transfer and hand the deed back to me. But the story did not end with a simple real estate reversal. We sat in the quiet office, the weight of the federal crimes hanging in the air. The straw purchase of my townhouse was a desperate act of preservation. Isabella had avoided prison, balanced her books, and acquired a valuable piece of property for pennies on the dollar. She survived the audit. She should have counted her blessings, kept her head down, and remained entirely silent. But greedy people rarely know when to stop. The golden child believed she was invincible. She believed her parents would always fix her mistakes, and that her blue-collar sister was too weak to ever fight back. Operating under that staggering delusion, she prepared her next move. Believing they had gotten away with the perfect crime, what arrogant, hubristic mistake was Isabella about to make that would ensure their ultimate destruction? I remained seated in the polished leather guest chair of the downtown law firm. The revelations concerning the bridal embezzlement hung heavy in the air. We had unmasked the dark motive behind my stolen property. To any rational human being, successfully evading a prison sentence by secretly replacing stolen funds would serve as a profound wake-up call. A normal person would retreat, lay low, and express silent gratitude for escaping ruin. But my sister did not operate on logic or gratitude. Her entire identity rested on the relentless pursuit of social validation. Surviving was insufficient. She required an audience to witness her triumph. Evelyn opened a fresh manila folder, spreading a series of municipal building permits and contractor invoices across her desk. The paper trail revealed the second phase of their scheme. Isabella and Julian genuinely believed their corporate shell entity offered an impenetrable shield against any future scrutiny. Operating under that staggering delusion, they did not just let my Alexandria townhouse sit idle while they planned their next move. They transformed my sanctuary into a high-end construction zone. I traced my finger over a billing receipt from a premium remodeling firm. The golden couple injected $60,000 of remaining embezzled bridal deposits directly into the structure of my home. They tore out the modest butcher block counters I had installed myself, replacing them with imported Carrara marble. They gutted the sensible guest bathroom, expanding the footprint to construct a spa-inspired oasis featuring rainfall shower heads and heated slate tile. Seeing the invoices elicited a strange, hollow ache in my chest. I remembered the blisters on my palms from laying my own flooring. I remembered the specific shade of warm gray paint I chose for the living room. Isabella was not just flipping a real estate asset. She was systematically erasing my footprint from the world, replacing my hard-earned simplicity with her stolen luxury. Their objective was transparent. They intended to flip my property on the competitive spring real estate market, aiming for a listing price of $400,000. The projected profit would effortlessly cover their hidden debts and leave them with a substantial financial cushion. Yet, Isabella possessed a fatal flaw. Her vanity eclipsed her caution. She was engaged to be married, and a modest courthouse ceremony would never satisfy her curated aesthetic. She demanded a spectacular, lavish wedding event to cement her status among her affluent peers. Booking premium floral arrangements, a classical string quartet, and a historic estate venue required liquid cash, a resource she had already exhausted. She found her solution by weaponizing the stolen deed a second time. Evelyn slid a multi-page financial instrument toward me. It was a commercial promissory note from a prominent banking institution. Julian, acting as the sole managing member of Nova Holdings, pledged my townhouse as collateral to secure a $150,000 commercial line of credit. The breath hitched in my throat as I read the banking terms. By signing those loan documents, the golden couple crossed a terrifying legal threshold. Grandpa Mateo, sitting quietly beside me, leaned forward, tapping his polished cane against the floorboards. He viewed the document through the unyielding lens of a retired federal auditor. "They just built their own gallows," Mateo stated, his gravelly voice filled with grim certainty. Submitting a fraudulent property title to secure funds from a federally insured institution is not a minor civil infraction. It is a severe federal offense. Mateo explained the gravity of the situation. When Hector and Patricia orchestrated the fraudulent medical power of attorney to execute the initial sale, they committed a state-level forgery. But by using that exact forged deed to extract cash from a national bank, Isabella and Julian elevated the crime to bank fraud. My parents, as the originators of the false documents, were now inextricably linked to a federal conspiracy. Their reckless attempt to save their daughter from a local embezzlement scandal had ironically exposed the entire family to federal indictments. I looked at my attorney, expecting her to express outrage at their audacity. Instead, a chilling, satisfied smile touched the corners of Evelyn's lips. She explained her strategy. A lesser lawyer would have filed an immediate injunction the moment she discovered the shell company halting the renovations midway and fighting over a half-finished house. Evelyn chose a different, far more punishing path. She allowed them to spend their stolen money. She monitored the municipal inspection schedules, tracking the progress of the luxury upgrades from afar. She waited until the dust settled, the marble was polished, and the paint dried. The very morning, Julian contacted a premium real estate broker to officially list the flipped property. Evelyn executed her counterstrike. She filed a lis pendens against the title of the Alexandria townhouse. Evelyn outlined the mechanics of the legal maneuver. A lis pendens is a formal public notice of pending litigation attached directly to the county land records. It acts as a radioactive flag to the entire financial world. The mechanism is unyielding. The moment that document hits the registry, the property becomes legally untouchable. No rational buyer will submit an offer. No title insurance underwriter will issue a policy. The trap snapped shut with devastating precision. The federally insured bank, alerted to the severe legal dispute clouding their collateral, instantly froze the commercial line of credit. Julian could not draw another dollar to pay the wedding vendors. He could not sell the house to generate a profit. He could not refinance to extract the equity. The golden couple found themselves stranded in a beautiful, upgraded cage with zero access to their anticipated wealth. The financial chokehold squeezed the oxygen out of their opulent lifestyle. Isabella bridal clients were still demanding their overdue services. The luxury contractors who performed the home renovations started placing angry phone calls demanding their final installment payments. The wedding planner, who thrived on controlling the narrative, suddenly realized she possessed no control over her own survival. The shockwave of the frozen asset rippled outward, striking Hector and Patricia with full force. Their flawless country club reputation was now teetering on the edge of a public disaster. The untraceable cash they had generated to save their daughter was trapped behind a legal wall they could not breach. They were backed into a suffocating corner out of money and out of legal maneuvers. I knew my parents would not accept defeat gracefully. They believed their social standing granted them immunity from the rules that governed everyone else. When cornered animals realize the exits are blocked, they bare their teeth. The polite facade was about to drop, revealing the pure malice underneath. What dark, desperate tactics would they deploy to force my silence and regain control of their crumbling empire? The neon sign of the 24-hour diner flickered with a dull, erratic hum, casting a sickly yellow glow over the cracked asphalt parking lot. I sat inside an isolated corner booth, staring at the chipped formica table. The establishment was located 3 blocks from the hospital administration building, where I had spent the entire morning pleading with human resources personnel regarding my suspended nursing credentials. The air inside the restaurant smelled of burnt grease, stale filter coffee, and cheap industrial floor cleaner. It was a stark, jarring contrast to the manicured lawns, vaulted ceilings, and imported floral arrangements of my parents' sprawling estate. The small brass bell above the entrance chimed, signaling new arrivals. Hector and Patricia walked through the glass doors. They looked entirely out of place amidst the tired truck drivers and exhausted shift workers. My father wore a rumpled khaki trench coat over his golf polo. My mother gripped the leather handles of her designer handbag so tightly, her knuckles appeared translucent. They scanned the faded linoleum floor, spotted me sitting in the dim corner, and marched directly over. They did not wait for a polite invitation. They slid into the booth across from me, their movements stiff and uncoordinated. The immaculate country club polish that defined their entire existence had evaporated. Hector's jaw remained clenched tight, a subtle muscle ticking nervously near his temple. Patricia's hands shook as she adjusted her silk scarf, her eyes darting around the room to ensure no one was watching them. Evelyn legal maneuvers had systematically drained their oxygen. The frozen property title and the stalled commercial loan backed my parents into a desperate, terrifying corner. They were bleeding social capital, losing sleep, and running out of time to shield Isabella from her looming bridal embezzlement scandal. The panic radiated from their rigid posture. Hector did not offer a warm greeting or inquire about my healing surgical scars. He reached into his coat pocket and extracted a thick, unmarked white envelope. He placed the package onto the sticky laminate table and pushed it precisely across the center line, stopping inches from my coffee mug. He instructed me to look inside. I peeled back the paper flap. Stacks of crisp $100 bills stared back at me. It was $10,000 in untraceable cash. "We can end this ugliness today," my father stated. His voice lacked its usual booming theatricality. It was reduced to a harsh, constrained whisper. "You instruct your attorney to release the lien on the Alexandria property. You drop the civil litigation entirely. You walk away and you take this envelope as a fresh start." I looked at the money, studying the precise green ink on the currency, then shifted my gaze to my mother. I asked them what would happen to the formal ethics complaint Patricia filed with the state licensing board. Patricia leaned forward, invading my physical space. Her eyes were devoid of any maternal affection, holding only the cold calculation of a cornered predator. "If you accept the arrangement, I will formally retract the allegations," she promised, her tone dipping into a smooth, poisonous cadence. "I will tell the investigators it was a terrible misunderstanding born out of grief over your car accident. I will say you are seeking private counseling and pose no risk to your patients. Your professional record will be cleared. You can return to your trauma ward by Monday morning." Hector leaned closer, reinforcing the ultimatum. The smell of his expensive cologne mixed sickeningly with the diner's stale air. "But if you insist on dragging your sister through a public trial," he warned, his words laced with unfiltered malice, "we will ensure you never touch a stethoscope again. Your mother will testify against you. We will parade your aunts and cousins before the medical board to confirm your mental instability. We will tie you up in administrative hearings for years. You will be permanently blacklisted from practicing medicine anywhere in this country." They were openly extorting me. They were attempting to hold my professional identity hostage to guarantee Isabella freedom. They expected me to break down in tears, succumb to the sheer weight of their threats, and accept the bribe just to reclaim my livelihood. A few weeks ago, hearing my own parents openly plot the destruction of my career might have reduced me to weeping. I might have caved to the systemic pressure. However, surviving a grueling career in critical care teaches a practitioner how to compartmentalize profound trauma. During intense intensive care shifts, I relied on a specialized dictation smartwatch to record patient symptoms and chart complex medical histories on the fly. The device featured a highly sensitive omnidirectional microphone capable of capturing a faint whisper inside a chaotic, echoing emergency room. When I sat down in the booth an hour prior, I had unclasped the heavy device from my wrist because the metal band irritated my skin. I placed the watch face down on the table, resting it right beside the glass sugar dispenser. When I saw my parents walk through the diner doors, anticipating a hostile confrontation, I subtly tapped the side button, activating the voice memo application. Every single threat, every condition of their extortion, and the explicit admission of their false medical complaint was currently saving into a secure digital cloud file. My parents believed they were cornering a helpless, destitute daughter. In reality, they were feeding unassailable recorded evidence directly to their executioner. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or attempt to argue moral philosophy with people who possessed no conscience. I reached out and rested my fingertips lightly on the white envelope. Hector's shoulders relaxed a fraction of an inch. He exhaled a long, shaky breath, assuming I was accepting the bribe. He believed his money and his intimidation had successfully purchased my silence. Instead, I slid the package back across the sticky table until the thick paper bumped against his knuckles. "Keep your cash," I replied, my voice steady, quiet, and unyielding. "You are going to need every single dollar to pay your defense attorneys." I picked up my smartwatch, secured the metal band around my wrist, and stood up from the booth. Patricia's face crumpled into a mask of pure, undisguised horror as she realized the negotiation had failed. She reached out her hand, hovering over the Formica surface, but she could not find the words to stop me. I walked out of the diner, pushing through the glass doors and stepping back into the crisp Virginia air. I left them trapped in the dingy booth with their useless currency and their impending doom. The audio file resting on my wrist transformed the entire battlefield. It provided the ultimate, undeniable proof of witness tampering, blackmail, and perjury. We no longer had to rely solely on complex paper trails to prove their malice. I possessed their own voices detailing their criminal conspiracy. How would Evelyn Cross deploy this explosive recording to tighten the legal noose around their necks in the upcoming civil deposition? The confrontation shifted from the grease-stained booth of the late-night diner into the pristine, climate-controlled environment of Evelyn Cross downtown law firm. The conference room sat on the top floor of a glass high-rise, offering a sprawling, unhindered view of the Potomac River. The space was designed to intimidate. The walls were paneled in rich, dark walnut. The center of the room was dominated by a long mahogany table that smelled faintly of lemon polish and expensive leather. I took my seat on one side of the table, folding my hands in my lap to hide a slight nervous tremor. My healing body ached from the prolonged stress, but my mind remained incredibly sharp. Evelyn sat to my right, unpacking a series of unmarked manila folders with precise, measured movements. Grandpa Mateo sat in the corner of the room, resting both hands on his wooden cane. He positioned himself in the shadows, functioning as a silent, unblinking sentinel. The heavy glass door swung open, and my parents walked into the room. Hector and Patricia had recovered from the panic that drove them to ambush me at the diner. They walked into the law firm radiating a toxic, fragile arrogance. Hector wore a tailored navy suit with crisp French cuffs, projecting the aura of a successful patriarch inconvenienced by a trivial administrative error. Patricia wore a string of pearls and carried her designer handbag, her posture rigid and defensive. They believed they still held the winning hand. They assumed the suspension of my nursing license and my lack of steady income meant I was operating on borrowed time. They did not understand the magnitude of the predator sitting across from them. This tragic miscalculation was evident in their choice of legal representation. My parents were flanked by a low-tier defense attorney who looked entirely out of his depth. The man wore an ill-fitting gray suit and carried a thin, disorganized briefcase. He wiped his palms nervously against his trousers as he took in the opulent surroundings of the conference room. Hector and Patricia hired a discount lawyer because they thought this civil deposition was merely a formality, a tedious hurdle to clear before I finally surrendered. A certified court reporter sat at the far end of the mahogany table, positioning her fingers over the keys of a stenography machine. She asked Hector and Patricia to raise their right hands. She administered the standard oath, asking them to swear under penalty of perjury that the testimony they were about to give was the truth. Hector offered a flippant, patronizing nod. Patricia replied with a soft, practiced tone of earnest compliance. They lowered their hands, entirely unaware that the trap had just snapped shut. Evelyn Cross was a master of psychological warfare. She did not open the deposition by slamming banking records onto the table or playing the explosive audio file from my smartwatch. She started the interrogation with a soft, almost bored demeanor. She asked tedious, mundane questions about their home address, their employment history, and their basic relationship to me. She skillfully lulled them into a false sense of security. Hector leaned back in his plush leather chair, crossing one leg over his knee. Patricia relaxed her grip on her handbag. They exchanged a brief, smug glance, silently concluding that my expensive downtown lawyer was toothless. Once their defenses were thoroughly lowered, Evelyn executed a subtle pivot. She shifted the timeline to the morning of my highway collision and the subsequent weeks I spent in the intensive care unit. Evelyn asked Hector to describe my medical state during the days leading up to the sale of my townhouse. My father leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. He looked directly at the court reporter, ensuring his words were captured accurately. He testified that I was awake, lucid, and highly communicative. He claimed I was deeply distressed about my mounting hospital bills. According to his sworn testimony, I looked him in the eye and gave him explicit verbal consent to contact a real estate agent and manage my financial affairs. I sat frozen in my chair, staring at the man who contributed half of my genetic code. I was on a mechanical ventilator during that exact time frame. A thick plastic tube was shoved down my trachea to breathe for me. I was chemically paralyzed by a continuous intravenous drip to prevent my broken ribs from shifting. I could not open my eyes, let alone negotiate a real estate liquidation. The sheer audacity of his lie was breathtaking. He spun his fabricated narrative directly into the official court transcript without a single hesitation. Evelyn did not interrupt him. She nodded slowly, her expression remaining neutral, and turned her attention to Patricia. She asked my mother to explain the mechanics of the property transfer. Patricia adjusted her pearls, adopting the mournful expression of a mother burdened by tragic circumstances. She swore on the official record that the sale was a legitimate arm's-length transaction. She claimed they listed the property quickly because the creditors were threatening to seize my assets. She testified that the townhouse was sold to an unknown independent buyer looking for a starter home. Evelyn flipped open a thin folder. She asked Patricia a very specific, carefully worded question. Did you, your husband, or any member of your immediate family have a prior relationship with the purchasing entity known as Nova Holdings Limited Liability Company? Patricia maintained unblinking eye contact with Evelyn. She offered a flat, definitive denial. She swore she had never heard the name of the company before the closing date. Evelyn pressed further, asking if my sister Isabella or her fiancé Julian participated in the transaction, provided funds for the purchase, or received any equity from the sale. Patricia scoffed, softly shaking her head. "Of course not," she replied, her tone dripping with manufactured offense. "Isabella has her own life. She had nothing to do with this terrible situation." The stenography machine clicked rhythmically, capturing every syllable of their deceit. My heart hammered a furious rhythm against my sternum. The urge to intervene was almost unbearable. I wanted to reach across the table and shake them. I wanted to pull the state registry documents out of Evelyn's briefcase and force them to read Julian's name. I wanted to play the digital audio recording from the diner, forcing the entire room to listen to their voices, threatening my medical license and demanding a bribe. But beneath the table, out of sight from the defense attorney, Evelyn placed a steady, restraining hand on my knee. She required my silence. She needed them to dig the hole so deep that the walls would eventually collapse and bury them. By allowing Hector and Patricia to deny any knowledge of the corporate shell entity and the bridal embezzlement scheme, she transformed a civil dispute over a piece of property into a severe federal liability. Perjury under oath is a crime that carries devastating consequences, especially when the lies are designed to cover up systemic wire fraud. Evelyn concluded her questioning after another 20 minutes. She closed her folders and thanked them for their time. Hector and Patricia stood up from their leather chairs. They smoothed their expensive clothes, exchanging triumphant smiles. Their cheap defense attorney packed his flimsy briefcase, looking relieved that the formidable litigator had not grilled his clients harder. My parents believed they had navigated the deposition flawlessly. They thought they had outsmarted the system, preserving their pristine social facade while securing Isabella's freedom. They walked out of the conference room, the heavy glass door clicking shut behind them. They left the law firm believing they had won the war. But the deposition phase was far from over. Hector and Patricia were disciplined, sociopathic liars, heavily practiced in the art of country club deception. They could spin a false narrative without their heart rates ever spiking. But a complex real estate conspiracy requires multiple participants, and not every participant possesses the iron nerves of a wealthy narcissist. The people my parents bribed to execute the fraud were not hardened criminals. They were opportunistic cowards. What happens when Evelyn Cross directs her lethal focus away from the arrogant ringleaders and drags the fragile, terrified, weak link of their entire operation into the interrogation chair? My parents strutted out of the high-rise office building, believing they had outsmarted the system. They failed to realize that a conspiracy is only as strong as its weakest link. Hector and Patricia possessed the sociopathic discipline required to lie under oath without flinching. They were accustomed to bending the truth to fit their pristine country club narrative. But they outsourced the manual labor of their fraud. Evelyn Cross and Grandpa Mateo anticipated this exact vulnerability. Their strategy was a flawless flanking maneuver. By allowing my parents to confidently commit perjury on the official court record first, Evelyn ensured they were trapped. Once Hector and Patricia swore they had no knowledge of any deceit, Evelyn pivoted her lethal focus to the hired help. She issued a subpoena for the individual who stamped the forged power of attorney. Dennis Fletcher operated a cramped shipping and packing franchise squeezed between a dry cleaner and a discount liquor store in a strip mall. He supplemented his meager retail income by functioning as a commissioned state notary public. He was a small-time opportunist, the kind of man willing to cut minor administrative corners for a $20 tip. Dennis walked into Evelyn's conference room 3 days after my parents gave their perjured testimony. The contrast was stark. He did not wear a tailored navy suit or project upper-class arrogance. He wore a rumpled short-sleeve button-down shirt. A sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead before he even took his seat. He was a fragile, terrified man, dragged into an intimidating legal arena far above his weight class. The certified court reporter administered the oath. Dennis raised a trembling hand, his voice cracking as he swore to tell the truth. Evelyn initiated the interrogation with the same calm, methodical pacing she used on my parents. She established his credentials, having him confirm his state commission number and the duration of his business operations. She placed a copy of the forged power of attorney onto the mahogany table. She asked him to verify the ink signature and the embossed state seal at the bottom of the page. Dennis swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing against his tight shirt collar. He nodded, trying to maintain a facade of professional routine. He swore on the official record that the stamp belonged to him. He testified that I, Drusilla Rivera, stood in his storefront on the morning of October 12th. He claimed I presented a valid driver license, answered his procedural questions, and signed the paperwork in his physical presence. Evelyn did not ask a follow-up question right away. She let a long, suffocating silence stretch across the room. She reached into her structured leather briefcase and retrieved a thick, heavy binder bearing the official crest of the Fairfax Hospital System. She opened the binder, flipped to a specific tab section, and pushed the documents directly in front of the sweating notary. "I want you to review these certified medical logs, Mr. Fletcher," Evelyn instructed, her voice dropping to a cold, clinical cadence. The pages displayed my intensive care unit charting. Evelyn guided his eyes to the timestamp printed in the top right corner, October 12th, 9 o'clock in the morning. She read the attending physician notes aloud for the court reporter. Patient remains in a chemically induced coma. Deep sedation protocols active. Patient intubated and reliant on a mechanical ventilator for respiratory function. Evelyn leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table. Mr. Fletcher, my client was unconscious, paralyzed by intravenous medication and breathing through a plastic tube at the exact minute you claim she was standing in your strip mall franchise holding a ballpoint pen. Dennis paled. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen gray. His hands began to shake violently, rattling the paper cup of water resting near his elbow. He stammered, attempting to backtrack, suggesting there might have been a clerical error regarding the date or a mix-up with his scheduling book. He was drowning, searching for a life raft that did not exist. This is where Grandpa Mateo intervened. The retired forensic auditor did not yell or pound his fists. He simply leaned forward in his chair, resting his chin on his hands. He spoke with the quiet, lethal certainty of a man who spent 4 decades hunting tax evaders and dismantling organized crime fronts. Mr. Fletcher Mateo began, his gravelly voice echoing off the walnut panels. Falsifying a state notary log is a serious local offense. You will lose your commission and face hefty fines. However, facilitating the fraudulent transfer of real estate equity across state lines using a federally insured bank constitutes federal wire fraud. Mateo placed a thin brown folder on the table. He outlined the federal sentencing guidelines. He painted a vivid, terrifying picture of federal prosecutors tearing through Dennis' business records, auditing his taxes, and locking him in a federal penitentiary for the next decade. He offered the terrified man a single, fleeting lifeline. You can become a cooperating witness today, Mateo offered, locking his piercing gaze onto the trembling notary. Or you can take the fall for a wealthy country club family who views you as disposable trash. They will let you rot in a cell to save their own skin. Choose right now. Dennis fractured. The thin veneer of loyalty bought by my parents evaporated under the crushing weight of a federal threat. He buried his face in his hands and began to weep. The sound was pathetic, a wet, guttural sobbing that filled the quiet room. He reached for a fresh tissue from the center of the table, wiping his face as he confessed everything to the court reporter. He detailed the exact mechanics of the crime. Patricia Rivera did not bring me into his shipping store. She called his personal cell phone. They arranged a meeting in the dim, unlit parking lot behind the discount liquor store. Dennis described how he walked over to my mother's luxury sport utility vehicle. He slid into the passenger seat. Patricia handed him a manila envelope. Inside, he found the pre-signed, forged real estate documents and $5,000 in crisp $50 bills. She told him it was a simple family emergency, assuring him that no one would ever check the timestamps or question the paperwork. Hearing the detailed confession elicited a sharp, sickening ache in my chest. $5,000. My mother walked into a dirty parking lot and paid a stranger $5,000 to ruin my life, steal my sanctuary, and strip away my financial independence. She traded my future for a stack of cash to protect Isabella. The profound, staggering depth of her betrayal was now a matter of public record. Evelyn slid a blank legal affidavit across the table, accompanied by a heavy fountain pen. Dennis grabbed the pen. His hand shook as he documented his own felony, cementing his confession in dark blue ink. He traded his state commission and his dignity for a desperate plea deal, hoping his cooperation would spare him from a federal indictment. When he finished signing the final page, Evelyn dismissed him. He stood up, his posture hunched, and scurried out of the conference room, eager to escape the suffocating pressure of the law firm. The defense's entire foundation crumbled into dust. The narrative of the struggling veteran family, the lie about my verbal consent, and the fake emergency medical crisis were systematically obliterated. The civil case was no longer a battle to be fought in a courtroom. It was an execution waiting to be carried out. I held the irrefutable sworn proof required to reclaim my Alexandria townhouse. Evelyn gathered the signed affidavit, snapping her briefcase shut with a satisfying metallic click. We possessed the winning hand. But as we prepared to leave the conference room, I noticed a subtle movement in the corner of my eye. Grandpa Mateo was packing his own belongings. He slipped the thin brown folder back into his worn leather briefcase. Behind it, nestled deep in the main compartment, sat a different, much thicker dossier sealed with red wax. It was a file he had never shown Evelyn. It contained documents he had never discussed during our strategy sessions. The civil victory was secured, guaranteeing the return of my property. But what jaw-dropping climax had the retired federal auditor secretly orchestrated behind the scenes? What catastrophic storm was he preparing to unleash upon my family? The morning of the summary judgment hearing arrived, wrapped in a biting, overcast chill. The sky above Fairfax County was a bruised, heavy gray, mirroring the dense tension pooling in my stomach. I stood at the base of the Virginia courthouse, staring up at the towering granite columns. 6 weeks prior, I was shivering on a dark asphalt driveway, locked out of my own life, relying on a borrowed fleece blanket for warmth. Today, the physical weakness of my coma recovery was a distant memory. The surgical incisions across my abdomen had faded into dull, numb lines. I wore a sharp, tailored charcoal suit, my posture straight, my lungs expanding effortlessly in the crisp winter air. I climbed the stone steps not as a helpless victim, but as a heavily armed adversary, ready to reclaim my stolen sanctuary. I pushed through the heavy oak double doors of courtroom 4B. The interior smelled of floor wax and old paper. The wooden pews in the gallery creaked softly as a few scattered law clerks took their seats. I walked to the plaintiff table and sat down. My hands rested steadily on the polished walnut surface. Beside me, Evelyn Cross was already unpacking her structured leather briefcase. She arranged her files with the precise, methodical focus of a surgeon preparing a scalpel. We held the notarized confession from the strip mall clerk and the digital audio recording from the greasy diner. We possessed the exact ammunition required to end the dispute. A few moments later, the opposing doors swung open. Hector, Patricia, and Isabella entered the room. It was the first time I had seen my sister since the Thanksgiving dinner. Isabella did not look like a radiant bride preparing for a lavish wedding. Her designer silk blouse was wrinkled, and dark circles bruised the delicate skin under her eyes. Evelyn, filing of the legal lien, had frozen the Alexandria property, cutting off Isabella access to the stolen equity she desperately needed to appease her angry vendors. The golden child was cracking under the immense financial pressure. My parents flanked her, projecting a fragile, paper-thin arrogance. Hector adjusted his silk tie, his jaw clenched tight. Patricia clutched her expensive handbag, refusing to look in my direction. They still believed their upper-class respectability would shield them from severe consequence. They viewed civil court as a polite venue where affluent families negotiated quiet settlements behind closed doors. They hired their cheap, inexperienced defense attorney to facilitate a discreet surrender, hoping to pay a minor penalty and walk away with their social status intact. They were clinging to a profound delusion. The bailiff announced the arrival of the presiding magistrate. We all stood as Judge Harrison took his seat at the elevated bench. He was a veteran jurist with silver hair and a stern, deeply lined face. During his tenure, he had built a formidable reputation for dispensing swift, unyielding justice. He harbored zero tolerance for white-collar fraud, viewing financial predators with distinct, palpable disdain. He adjusted his reading glasses, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom before settling on the defense table. The clerk called the docket number to order. Judge Harrison asked if there were any preliminary motions before he ruled on the summary judgment. The discount defense attorney scrambled to his feet. He wiped a sheen of nervous sweat from his forehead and gripped the edges of his flimsy podium. He did not attempt to argue the facts of the real estate transfer, likely realizing the paper trail was indefensible. Instead, he attempted a desperate emotional plea. "Your Honor," the defense counsel began, his voice wavering slightly under the intense scrutiny of the bench. We formally request a temporary stay of these proceedings. This is, at its core, a private familial dispute born out of an unfortunate misunderstanding. My clients acted under immense emotional duress during a terrifying medical crisis involving their daughter. We ask the court to refer this matter to private mediation so the Rivera family can heal without the burden of a public judgment. I listened to the lawyer spin his hollow fiction, my pulse maintaining a slow, steady rhythm. A private familial dispute. He was trying to rebrand a calculated, predatory straw purchase and a forged medical document as a simple miscommunication over a Thanksgiving turkey. My parents wanted to negotiate behind closed doors because sunlight would incinerate their pristine reputation. They wanted to avoid the public record. Evelyn did not scoff or roll her eyes. She calmly picked up the blue folder containing the sworn affidavit from Dennis Fletcher, the corrupt notary who confessed to accepting a $5,000 cash bribe in a liquor store parking lot. She intended to submit the document into evidence, shattering the defense plea for mediation and exposing the perjury Hector and Patricia committed during their earlier deposition. She placed her hands on the table, preparing to stand and deliver the fatal rebuttal. Before she could rise from her chair, a distinct, rhythmic tapping echoed from the back of the courtroom. The sound of a wooden cane striking the marble floor drew every eye in the room. Grandpa Mateo slowly stood up from the wooden gallery pew. He wore his classic, impeccably tailored suit, his posture unbowed by his 78 years. He did not look at my parents. He did not acknowledge the sweating defense attorney. He walked down the center aisle with the terrifying, unhurried cadence of a man holding a royal flush. He bypassed our plaintiff table entirely. Mateo approached the low swinging gate that separated the gallery from the judicial bench. In his left hand, he carried a single, thick manila envelope. The flap was secured by a heavy seal of deep red wax. It was an archaic, highly official method of securing sensitive documents, a remnant from his 4 decades operating deep within the intelligence divisions of the Internal Revenue Service. Your Honor, Mateo stated. His gravelly voice sliced through the silent room, carrying a weight and authority that demanded immediate compliance. I request permission to approach the bench as an officer of the court. Judge Harrison peered over the rim of his glasses. He studied the retired forensic auditor, recognizing the quiet, unyielding demeanor of a fellow veteran of the justice system. The magistrate offered a short, approving nod. Mateo stepped through the wooden gate and handed the wax-sealed package directly to the court clerk, who passed it up to the elevated bench. The defense attorney sputtered, objecting to the sudden introduction of unverified evidence, but Judge Harrison silenced him with a sharp raise of his hand. This civil matter is inextricably linked to an active federal investigation, Mateo declared, his gaze locking onto the judge. The documents inside that envelope supersede the jurisdiction of this civil hearing. Hector sank back into his leather chair, the color draining from his cheeks. Patricia covered her mouth with her trembling hand. Isabella gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning stark white. They watched Judge Harrison pick up a silver letter opener. The sharp blade sliced through the red wax seal, tearing the heavy manila paper. The judge pulled a thick stack of formal, watermarked documents from the envelope. He began to read the top page. The courtroom held its collective breath. The stern, seasoned magistrate, a man who had presided over thousands of complex trials, suddenly stopped reading. The natural color evaporated from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, ghostly pale. He lowered the documents, his eyes darting from the paper down to my parents sitting at the defense table. What specific, horrifying words were printed on those federal documents that could make a hardened Superior Court judge turn pale? Judge Harrison lowered the thick parchment, laying it flat against the elevated wooden bench. The rhythmic clicking of the court reporter's stenography machine ceased. The silence that followed was dense and suffocating. A veteran jurist who had spent decades presiding over complex corporate litigation, Harrison possessed a famously stoic demeanor. Yet as his eyes scanned the final pages of the wax-sealed documents, the natural color drained from his face. His skin turned an ashen, sickly pale. He removed his reading glasses, letting them drop onto his desk, and stared down at my parents. Hector and Patricia shifted in their leather chairs. The fragile arrogance they carried into the room began to fracture. My father gripped the edge of the defense table, his knuckles turning stark white. He recognized the shift in the atmosphere. He understood that the papers delivered by my grandfather did not contain a simple civil injunction or a request for a tedious administrative delay. Mateo had not just spent the last 6 months auditing Isabella business accounts to aid my civil dispute. The retired forensic investigator viewed local county courts as stepping stones. He operated on a much higher, far more lethal frequency. When he uncovered the bridal embezzlement, the forged medical documents, and the subsequent real estate laundering, he bypassed the local Virginia authorities entirely. He compiled his extensive dossier, organized the financial ledgers, and handed the entire package directly to his former colleagues at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The envelope rested on the judge bench. It contained official, signed, federal grand jury indictments. The dramatic irony of their situation was breathtaking. Hector and Patricia believed they were executing a quiet, contained family secret. They assumed a forged signature on a local property deed would remain buried in the county archives. They fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of modern finance. When they sold my Alexandria townhouse to Julian corporate shell entity, the funds were processed through an interstate bank transfer to launder the stolen equity. Furthermore, Isabella and Julian used that exact stolen deed as collateral to secure a commercial line of credit from a federally insured lending institution. By moving fraudulent funds across state lines and attempting to defraud a national bank, my parents elevated a local forgery into a sprawling federal conspiracy. The Department of Justice does not view these actions as a tragic parental intervention. They view it as a coordinated criminal enterprise. The indictments named Hector and Patricia Rivera as active co-conspirators in a federal wire fraud ring, subjecting them to the unforgiving penalties of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on the defense counsel. "Your request for private mediation is denied," the magistrate stated, his voice ringing with a cold, terrifying finality. "This court will not facilitate a quiet settlement for individuals currently facing federal prosecution for the very transaction under dispute." The defense attorney shrank back into his chair, physically distancing himself from his clients. He was hired for a simple real estate defense. He had no intention of sinking with a sinking ship targeted by the federal government. Based on the irrefutable evidence of forgery and systemic fraud submitted into the record, Judge Harrison continued picking up his wooden gavel. "I hereby declare the property transfer of the Alexandria townhouse null and void. The deed is immediately restored to the plaintiff, Drusilla Rivera. Furthermore, because the defendants and their proxies operated in extreme bad faith, any capital improvements or structural upgrades funded by the shell company are forfeited. The plaintiff assumes full ownership of the property in its current renovated condition." The gavel struck the sounding block. The loud, definitive crack sealed my victory. I just won back my home along with $60,000 worth of imported marble and luxury spa bathrooms entirely free of charge. They stole my modest sanctuary and accidentally returned a high-end showcase. But the swift administration of civil justice was merely the opening act. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open before the echo of the gavel faded. A team of plainclothes federal agents marched down the center aisle. They wore dark suits, their badges visible on their belts, moving with a synchronized, tactical precision. The atmosphere in the room shifted from tense litigation to a live criminal takedown. Hector froze. The polished, upper-class patriarch who boasted about his heroic interventions at Thanksgiving dinner was paralyzed by sheer terror. Patricia let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She tried to stand, attempting to deploy her practiced country club charm, perhaps hoping to negotiate with the armed officers as if they were difficult catering vendors. The lead agent did not entertain her protests. He instructed her to turn around and place her hands behind her back. The metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping around my mother's wrists was the loudest sound in the room. Hector was cuffed moments later, his tailored navy suit bunching awkwardly around his shoulders as he was hauled to his feet. The people who tried to destroy my nursing career, who sold my life while I was trapped in a coma, were paraded out of the courtroom in disgrace. Their pristine social standing, the very illusion they sacrificed me to protect, was permanently obliterated. But the sting of the federal sweep extended far beyond the courthouse walls. Isabella was absent from the defense table during the climactic ruling. Just 15 minutes before the judge took the bench, the suffocating tension had proven too much for the golden child. Clinging to the fragile delusion of her curated reality, she had whispered a panicked excuse to her lawyer and slipped out the back doors. She fled to a luxury boutique in Georgetown for her final bridal gown fitting, desperately pretending her empire was still intact. Her escape provided no shelter. The Federal Bureau of Investigation prefers to execute multi-target indictments simultaneously to prevent suspects from destroying evidence. As my parents were escorted into the back of a black government vehicle in Fairfax, a separate tactical team breached the glass storefront of the upscale Georgetown bridal shop. Agents swarmed the boutique, ignoring the protests of the horrified store manager. They found Isabella standing on a velvet pedestal, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling mirrors. She was draped in layers of imported white silk and intricate French lace, admiring the reflection of a wedding she funded with stolen money. The lead agent read her Miranda rights over the soft, ambient classical music playing through the store speakers. She shrieked a raw, humiliating sound that shattered her flawless persona. The agents did not allow her to change into her street clothes. They pulled her arms behind her back, securing the steel cuffs over the delicate lace sleeves of her custom gown. The golden child was dragged out of the boutique and pushed into the back of a federal cruiser, a weeping, ruined spectacle broadcast to the affluent shoppers on the busy sidewalk. I remained seated at the plaintiff table, breathing in the quiet air of the emptying courtroom. The villains who engineered my destruction were stripped of their wealth, their freedom, and their pride. The long, grueling war of attrition was over. The physical and financial boundaries were restored. Yet as the adrenaline faded from my veins, a new reality began to take shape. With the perpetrators locked in federal holding cells and their sprawling estate left unguarded, what ultimate poetic justice awaited the survivor who emerged from the ashes? The heavy oak doors of the Virginia courthouse closed, sealing the destruction of the Rivera family hierarchy. The federal sweep triggered an immediate, uncompromising aftermath that systematically dismantled every layer of the false empire my parents had spent their lives building. The very next morning, my legal team presented the digital audio recording from the late-night diner directly to the Virginia Board of Nursing. The investigators listened to my mother explicitly threatening to ruin my career, and my father openly bribing me to drop the civil lawsuit. The extortion recording served as undeniable proof of their malice. The administrative board immediately rescinded the emergency suspension. My nursing credentials were fully restored, my professional records scrubbed clean of the fabricated ethics complaint. I received clearance to return to the intensive care unit by the end of the week. But as I stepped back into my scrubs, navigating the familiar, chaotic rhythm of the trauma ward, my parents were plunging into an agonizing new reality. Hector, Patricia, and Isabella were denied bail during their initial arraignment. The federal prosecutors argued successfully that their vast network of international vendors and their proven capacity for complex financial forgery made them severe flight risks. They were remanded to a federal holding facility, stripped of their tailored suits and designer handbags, forced to wear standard-issue jumpsuits. The financial hemorrhage was catastrophic. Retaining elite federal criminal defense attorneys requires an astronomical influx of liquid capital. Because Julian and Isabella had already drained the embezzled bridal deposits, and my parents had lost the stolen equity from my townhouse, they possessed zero cash reserves. The Department of Justice immediately seized their remaining investment portfolios and froze their personal bank accounts under the RICO indictments. The sprawling, manicured Northern Virginia estate that served as the crown jewel of their country club identity was severely leveraged. Without access to their wealth, they missed 3 consecutive mortgage payments. The lending institution acted with the same ruthless efficiency my parents once displayed. The bank initiated rapid foreclosure proceedings. The grand house, filled with imported floral centerpieces and expensive Cabernet, was seized. Sitting in a stark, cinder-block visitation room during a brief, approved phone call, my mother attempted one final, desperate manipulation. Her voice trembled through the heavy glass partition, stripped of its polished arrogance. "Drusilla, please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "You have your house back. You have the equity. You have to take out a loan against the townhouse and post our bail. We will lose the estate. We will lose everything. You cannot leave your own blood rotting in a cage." I held the heavy plastic receiver to my ear, listening to the woman who paid a corrupt notary $5,000 to erase my existence while I was trapped in a coma. She still believed familial duty was a one-way street. She still expected the daughter she sacrificed to rescue her from the fire. "I am sorry, Patricia," I replied, my voice steady, cold, and entirely devoid of guilt. "I am not authorizing a single transfer. You are going to face the consequences of the bed you made." I placed the receiver back onto the metal cradle, severing the connection, and walking out of the facility. I did not look back. I did not let their ruined estate fall into the hands of an anonymous developer. I recognized a unique poetic opportunity to utilize the very asset they stole to fund my future. Because Judge Harrison voided the fraudulent sale, I reclaimed the deed to my Alexandria townhouse, entirely free and clear of the commercial loan Isabella had secured. More importantly, I inherited the $60,000 in luxury renovations she funded with her stolen wedding money. The imported Carrara marble kitchen and the spa-quality bathrooms dramatically inflated the market value of the property. I leveraged that massive, unexpected equity. Combining the newly appraised value of my pristine townhouse with the hazard pay I accumulated by working back-to-back double shifts at the hospital, I possessed substantial capital. I waited until my parents' foreclosed estate went to public auction. Because the property was tainted by the high-profile federal fraud scandal, traditional buyers avoided it. I submitted a quiet, anonymous bid through Evelyn Cross legal firm. I purchased the sprawling mansion from the bank at a shockingly steep discount. I did not save their grand home to preserve their legacy. I bought it to dismantle the very symbol of their superficial, toxic wealth. I hired a team of contractors to gut the formal dining room where Hector had proudly announced my ruin at Thanksgiving. We partitioned the massive square footage, converting the opulent empty spaces into a series of comfortable, functional suites. I transformed the property into a subsidized cooperative living space designed specifically for exhausted traveling ICU nurses and medical residents. I provided a safe, affordable sanctuary for the people who actually performed grueling, honest labor. The estate that once hosted arrogant charity luncheons and sheltered embezzlers was now filled with dedicated professionals who spent their nights saving lives. I became the landlord of my parents' former kingdom, turning their monument to vanity into a lucrative, service-oriented enterprise. 6 months after the trial, a warm spring breeze rolled off the Potomac River, carrying the scent of blooming cherry blossoms. I sat on the front porch of my upgraded Alexandria townhouse, a steaming mug of coffee resting in my hands. The morning sun illuminated the quiet, peaceful neighborhood. Grandpa Mateo sat in a rocking chair beside me. He leaned his polished wooden cane against the railing, his sharp eyes surveying the street. He wore a light linen suit, his posture relaxed. We did not discuss the ongoing federal trial or the lengthy prison sentences Isabella and my parents were currently negotiating. They were ghosts, permanently exiled from our reality. I looked down at my abdomen. The deep, angry surgical scars that marked the beginning of my nightmare had faded into faint, pale silver lines. They no longer throbbed with pain when the weather turned cold. They were simply quiet reminders of a battle I survived. The toxic generational cycle of favoritism, manipulation, and deceit was permanently shattered. I did not surrender to their psychological warfare. I did not accept their extortion. I utilized relentless logic, unyielding boundaries, and the undeniable truth to tear their empire down to the studs. I reclaimed my sanctuary, protected my career, and built a new legacy entirely on my own terms. They tried to bury me to save their golden child. They forgot that when you bury a seed, it grows. They learned too late that the ultimate revenge is not screaming in a courtroom or demanding apologies from people incapable of remorse. The ultimate revenge is a life beautifully, powerfully lived. If you drive through the affluent, tree-lined neighborhoods of America, you will witness monuments to a specific kind of dream. You see sprawling brick estates, manicured emerald lawns, and imported luxury vehicles resting in wide driveways. These structures project an aura of security, tradition, and unwavering moral fortitude. But as we observe the landscape of modern society, we must learn to look past the pristine facades. We must listen to the quiet, desperate heartbeats echoing behind the heavy mahogany doors. The story of the Rivera family is far more than a sensational courtroom drama involving forged documents and federal indictments. Beneath the legal battles and the stolen real estate lies a profound, deeply unsettling spiritual parable. It serves as a stark cautionary tale for parents navigating a culture that is increasingly hypnotized by the glittering illusions of status, wealth, and external validation. When we lose our emotional anchor, we begin to treat our families not as sacred bonds, but as assets to protect our own fragile egos. Consider the fundamental tragedy of Hector and Patricia. They are not mere villains drawn from fiction. They are extreme manifestations of a very common corrosive sickness. They fell into the insidious trap of ego-driven parenting. They loved the idea of their eldest daughter, Isabella, because her luxury wedding business, her designer clothes, and her elevated social standing served as shining reflections of their own perceived success. She was a trophy they paraded before their country club community to validate their worth in an image-obsessed culture. In stark contrast, they discarded their youngest daughter, Drusilla. They rendered her invisible because her honest, grueling labor in a trauma-intensive care unit did not serve their vanity. When parents view their children as mere extensions of their own social capital, they commit a grave moral error. They stop seeing the true soul of the child. Traditional, grounded, and morally sound parenting requires the emotional awareness to love your children for the content of their inner character, not the volume of their external achievements. A child is a sacred life entrusted to your care. They are not a mirror polished simply to flatter your pride. This obsession with public perception led Hector and Patricia to commit an even deeper sin, which was the psychological sabotage of their own golden child. When Isabella's business began to fail and her staggering embezzlement came to light, her parents panicked. They orchestrated a ruthless heist, stealing Drusilla's hard-earned sanctuary while she lay unconscious on a hospital ventilator, all to secretly replace the stolen funds. They believed they were saving their daughter from ruin, but genuine love is not preventing a child from experiencing the pain of their own mistakes. Genuine love is standing steadfastly beside them while they face the music. By paying off her debts and frantically covering up her crimes, Hector and Patricia crippled Isabella's growth. Accountability is the harsh, rocky, but necessary soil where wisdom and morality take root. When you consistently shield a child from the natural consequences of their actions, you breed a dangerous entitlement. You rob them of the essential human opportunity to develop a moral compass. Isabella was never allowed to fall. Because she never learned how to fall gracefully, her eventual collapse brought down the entire family tree. Enabling is not compassion. It is spiritual theft. When parents cover up a misdeed to protect a reputation, they cease to be protectors and instead become accomplices to the downfall of their own child. Conversely, we must honor the profound dignity of resilience and honest labor, perfectly embodied by Drusilla. In our modern rush for quick wealth and shallow prestige, society desperately needs to return to valuing genuine grit and humility. Drusilla worked tirelessly, enduring physical exhaustion, spilled blood, and late nights to build her own safe harbor. When it was stolen from her, she did not seek malicious revenge. She sought righteous, documented justice. Parents across the country should actively cultivate these quiet virtues within their homes. We must teach our children that the cleanliness of their conscience is infinitely more valuable than the prestige of their zip code. The sweat on your brow from an honest day of work purifies the spirit in a way that unearned luxury never can. Drusilla's strength was weaponized against her by people who assumed her independence meant she required no care. Families must recognize that the strong child deserves as much protection and equity as the fragile one. We must also recognize the sacred, often misunderstood wisdom of establishing boundaries. When Drusilla ultimately achieved her victory in the courtroom, she did not offer a naive, enabling reconciliation that would allow the cycle to repeat. She converted her parents' foreclosed home into a cooperative living space, ensuring her own financial future, while permanently stripping them of the power to ever harm her again. Many people mistakenly believe that being a spiritual person means unconditionally tolerating abuse in the name of traditional family loyalty. This is a dangerous distortion of truth. Establishing ironclad boundaries is a high moral practice. It stops the generational cycle of karmic harm. You can forgive those who trespass against you without handing them the keys to your sanctuary. Protecting your peace, your energy, and your future is not an act of cruelty. It is a family responsibility. To lead a household with a steady hand, a mother and father must first look inward and do their own emotional work. Heal your insecurities. Detach from the hollow, exhausting pursuit of societal approval. A grounded parent does not care about the judgmental whispers of a country club or the gossip of a neighborhood association. They are anchored by a quiet, unshakable inner peace. They establish rules that protect their home from the toxic demands of the outside world, ensuring fairness reigns at the dinner table. We share these narratives not to cast judgment from a pedestal, but to awaken the dormant wisdom within us all. If this journey resonates with you, if you seek a space where we unravel the deep, often hidden truths of human nature and explore the emotional landscapes of family struggle and redemption, I invite you to join our community. Please hit the subscribe button and follow Sister Revenge. Share your own experiences in the comments below. Together, we can learn to build lives rooted in authenticity rather than illusion, fostering environments where honesty thrives. As the dust settles on the Rivera family ruin, the grand estate in Northern Virginia no longer belongs to them. The glittering trophies are packed away. The carefully curated social standing has evaporated into the cold winter air, leaving nothing behind but the heavy, silent weight of the truth. It makes one wonder as we navigate our own lives, raising our own children, and building our own legacies. When the applause fades, when the bank accounts are emptied, and when the watchful eyes of the community look away, what truly remains? If the universe were to strip away your titles, your wealth, and the image you present to the world, tomorrow morning it forces a difficult question regarding who would be standing in the dark. And more importantly, as you look at the faces gathered around your own table tonight, are you building a foundation strong enough to survive the storm, or are you just waiting for the rain to wash the paint away?